for getting your work out there in that respect.
And I'll pick up on that a bit too with the second question that we see about publishing 2 pieces along the same project. For me, I was told early on to learn how to make a mountain out of a molehill in terms of taking a tiny snippet of data. So if we're thinking about the project as really large, I think there's often little moments that we could make into different stories, maybe using different frameworks or for different audiences. But I don't know if Peter or Kate have more to add about that.
I would definitely agree with that. Some people that come from more quantitative backgrounds caution against this idea of like salami slicing, I've heard it called, where you're gaming the system just to have more to say. But I don't think that that's the norm. And I think oftentimes making as many unique publications out of the same study or data set, or however you want to think about it, is always a really smart idea. Those of you guys that have the option to do article format dissertations, for those of you that are still in grad school, I highly recommend that, because it helps you think about your dissertation study from the get-go in terms of different audiences and approaches. And I myself did that and had no trouble publishing multiple studies off of the same, multiple pieces out of the same study. And when I was asked questions from editors at one point about it, I was able to very quickly justify by saying that I was taking a different analytic approach in this component, or I was looking at a different slice of the data in this component. And there's many, many different ways you can differentiate different pieces. And when you do a large study like a dissertation, you should be able to write more than just one, like 50-page double-spaced article about it. And so it's just a matter of learning how to think about things for different audiences. At least for me, that's kind of what I think it comes down to. Even if it's audiences within the same field, there's still nuances to the audiences for different outlets. And part of successfully chunking up one study into multiple publications is in part thinking about audience, and in part thinking about what does this particular study have to offer in terms of different components, whether they're theoretical, methodological, implications, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree with Kate. And people tend to think that the only kind of publication is like this empirical study that they write about. And that's certainly one way to go, but you could also write very much a methodological study where you talk about how exactly you collected your data, because there's certainly a demand for such publications as well. As was mentioned, you're always targeting different audiences. Specifically talking about my own dissertation, it was based on 5 different case participants. So that alone allowed me to chop up the dissertation and get at least 5 publications by working on individual focal participants and writing about their individual experiences. Having said that, I've also used the same data in 2 publications, but I've also been very upfront about it when writing to the journal editor, when I say, look, I'm using the same data set, but number one, I'm using a different theoretical framework, and I'm, of course, giving it a very, very different interpretation or analysis. And so you don't want to be accused of self-plagiarism in that respect. One more point I do want to say is that many of us, when we're working off our dissertation research, we're all drawing on that same larger study. And it's inevitable, and it's also certainly acceptable when you're writing your methodology section that you are going to talk about that larger study on which you're drawing the book chapter or journal article material. But having said that, I do want to caution you, because journals, for example, use software like Authenticate to make sure that you're not plagiarizing. Of course, the worst kind of plagiarism is when you plagiarize someone's work, someone else's work, but you could also be self-plagiarizing, where I've encountered on several occasions authors submitting to TESOL Quarterly. What they do is that they cut and paste a whole chunk about their research site in their methodology section. and it's true, it's their work, and it's the same larger study on which they're drawing, on, but do at least kind of rephrase the methodology, so that you don't fall into that trap of having a high authenticate score and being accused of self-plagiarism. So yes, it is possible to publish, different types of publications from the same source. Mm-hmm.
Great. We're going to move on now then to looking at the questions related to where to submit. How do we figure out where we should submit? And I do want to make a quick note. We had a little technical difficulty at the beginning. So the first 3 minutes of the webinar did not get recorded. But like I said, we're taking copious notes. I just wanted to give you a heads up.
I'll go ahead and get started with this question. One of the things that a friend recommended to me was to take a look at the CVs of junior scholars that I really admired and kind of whose work I wanted to be in conversation with, and take a look at the places that they were publishing, because those are places that might already be open to publishing with and working alongside grad students. They're also obviously within the same sort of vein in terms of the research that I'm engaged in and want to continue to be a part of. And similarly, thinking about different sorts of organizations that might have their own publications. So I'm a part of the Literacy Research Association, or LRA, and they have a Student Research Award, which is due in August every year. And so that kind of serves as a great place that if you're awarded it, you go into kind of the conference proceedings, which I think is LRTMP, has a very long name. But even if you just get into the conference, you still have the opportunity to submit your work there, and it'll go through kind of a blind peer review. And so these are really, I think, great places to kind of get your general bearings in terms of where are other people that I read publishing, especially folks who are more junior in the field, and what places might have open avenues for me to write as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think in terms of identifying journals, the first thing I would do would be to look at my dissertation draft and look at my references section. If journal X appears 15 times in my dissertation references section, then that's a pretty good indicator that that's the journal or one of the journals you should be submitting to. All right, because clearly you follow that journal quite religiously, and therefore your work would probably be a good fit for that journal. Of course, there's another question about, is it a top tier journal, or you're wanting to increase your chances of getting published? Well, that's a question of how much time do you have, right? Let's say if you're an advanced doctoral student and you want to get something published relatively quickly, you can take a chance with a top tier journal, but bear in mind it takes a while to cycle through the review process. And let's say you submit to a top tier journal and it takes 1 year before you find out about the decision. And if unfortunately it's a reject, you have to start that process all over again. And the clock is ticking, for example, if you want to be on the job market in that respect. So one way of looking at the last question for me would be to think about what kind of a time frame. If you have a bit of a generous window, then go ahead. Yes, go ahead and try for that top tier journal, knowing full well that there's a possibility that you could be rejected, because everyone gets rejected, and I've certainly been rejected enough by top tier journals even today. So I would say, and I'll close here and hand over to Kate, but my basic advice is read the last 5-10 issues of a journal very carefully, right? And if your work resonates with that journal, then that's definitely one of the journals you want to send your work to, right? Yeah. On to you, Kate. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I agree with everything that Cassie and Peter have both said. I also, in addition to looking at who you've cited in your own dissertation, I always look to the not only where the most inspiring pieces that I've been reading have been published, but who are those people citing as well. So once you start to kind of see the same studies pop up a lot over and over again as you get more deep into your own areas of research, you'll notice, oh wow, it seems like a really important journal where the conversation I want to be a part of is taking place. And so that's another way to kind of get at that, along with the other recommendations that Cassie and Peter have. And I also think that it's true that publishing in top tier journals can take a lot longer, but you also tend to get really good feedback if you make it past the desk review stage. So oftentimes journals, the editor or editorial team will do a first pass. And if you make it past the first pass, it usually means that your submission is considered in scope with that journal, and that there's not any other reason why they would say, sorry, we're not interested in sending this out for review. So if you can get past that first stage, then you're at least likely to get really, really helpful reviews. But again, there is the issue of, do you have the time to wait around for that whole process to take place? But for me, I always kind of took that avenue, and it seemed to work out well. But there have been times where I was in a crunch where, let's say, I had a couple things get rejected in an important year, like third year review year, and I really needed to just get something going. Then that's when I would start going kind of down lower. And the idea of tiered journals is also a somewhat subjective distinction. There are certainly ones in any field where everyone will agree this is one of the hardest ones to get into, and all the important pieces are here, so to speak. But there's lots of different ways to argue for why a particular outlet is relevant for you and the audience you're trying to write for, and your scholarship and the way you're trying to present it. So building on something Cassie said earlier about practitioner journals, practitioner journals can also be considered top tier. It's just for a different audience, and knowing whether or not your institution values those sorts of publications, they are often shorter and sometimes have a less lengthy time to publication, and they can be very meaningful as well. So that's a couple bits of 2 cents that I had to offer on that topic.
I was going to add just one more thing. Oftentimes at conferences of organizations that do have journals, they'll have like a meet the editors session where it will be both like editors and members of the editorial board. And it's a great place, especially kind of as a graduate student, to get a better feel for what that journal is about, and maybe toss an idea or two out to different folks who are the editors to see if it does seem to be a good fit or not. So I think finding those kinds of opportunities is also very, very helpful.
Yes, exactly. Being proactive is very important. I'd like to address the third question on this slide here about if a journal has published similar manuscripts in recent issues. Is that a good sign? Yes and no, right? It's a good sign that you've at least found the right journal that's certainly interested in the general topic that you're working on. But at the same time, you'll need to produce a manuscript that has findings or offers a take that's kind of different from all the other previously published manuscripts, because the journal wouldn't want to be publishing more of the same. So I would say read those similar manuscripts very carefully, highlight what are their contributions to the field, but also make a very strong effort to point out how your work, while somewhat similar to the preceding or the earlier work, is also very different, and what's unique about your study. And if you can do that, I think you've got a strong chance of being journal for publication.
And Peter, would you say that using your cover letter to the editors is a smart place to kind of outline those?
Yes, I would think that can be used very effectively to highlight how your work is different. I think the cover letter to the editors, unfortunately, is underutilized, and people usually do like one-line cover letters. Dear editors, please find attached my manuscript. That's it. So say a little bit more about your work. And before I do forget this point, TESOL Quarterly, for example, has links to authors, and so one of the things I do check is their ORCID account, because when their name pops up in my electronic system or online system, And if an author has established an ORCID account, I click on that to see exactly what this individual has published. And I get a sense of, oh, okay, this is someone who obviously has a track record. And I don't want to be intimidated when I don't want you to be intimidated. But, you know, if you've got, for example, certain conference publications that you've done, and you can also upload your PowerPoint slides there. And that gives me a sense of who you are as an emerging scholar. And I think that's very important, as opposed to someone who has nothing in an online profile, right? And that makes it a little harder for us to figure out who is this submitting author, where is he or she coming from.
Peter, could I ask you really quick, when you referenced the name of that account, what
Yeah.
is it again?
ORCID.
ORCID? Okay.
So there's ORCID, there's academic.edu, and there's ResearchGate. And so the bottom line here is I encourage all of you to grow your digital presence, because I think editors, I certainly do, generally do a very quick Google search on submitting authors, because I want to see who is this person, what kind of work has he or she worked on, and so get a bigger sense, a greater sense of the research profile of the individual. So,
Great, thank you for adding to that. We're going to switch gears now to talk about when to submit. When do we know it's ready, the work that we're doing? And is there a better time to submit a manuscript versus other times?
Well, I'll start just since I can't see anyone. I think that there's a catch-22 here, especially for those of us that tend towards perfectionism or self-doubt, which many academics do, is it never feels ready enough. And so I find for myself, I set internal deadlines that I feel really guilty about if I don't make. And I tell all my academic friends, oh, I'm going to submit this paper by this date, so that if I don't do it, I feel even more guilty. Not everybody operates on the guilt incentive structure, but it works for me. And that being said, you don't want to send it out when it really could use a little more smoothing over on your end. That being said, it's easy to know what that feels like after you've done it a bunch of times. And so for me, when I was still getting used to playing the publishing game, I would have my writing group read manuscript drafts and give me feedback. I would sometimes ask a senior scholar to look at it, and I tried to get as much internal feedback on it that wasn't just me, because once you're very close to a piece and you've been working on it a long time, I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this, where you kind of can't see it anymore. You don't know if it's good or not, you don't know if it makes sense or not, and you need a little space and time from it. And giving it to someone else to look at is a great way to force that space and time, and then you kind of come back with slightly fresh eyes. Also, sometimes though, you need to submit something by a certain date because you have goal marks that you're trying to meet, like finishing your dissertation, applying for jobs, going up for third-year review, going up for tenure, all of these sorts of things. And so a lot of times it is a matter of, well, I have this deadline I have to make, so I'm going to make it happen. There's lots of different ways something can become ready. And even the paper that you might think is a slam dunk, you still might get a lot of constructive feedback and or rejection on it. But that's all useful for the next round as well. And like Peter said earlier, getting rejected is a very regular part of academic publishing, and it's not a referendum on the quality of your work overall or even that paper, but developing a thick skin and getting right back into it, I think, is really important. And so ready is one issue, but also knowing that even if it's ready, it might not be the right place yet is something to think about. But in general, feedback from as many people as you can get, and giving yourself time and space to put it down and pick it up again. I also, look, one last thing, sorry, this is kind of a long answer. I also find it very useful for me when I'm getting ready to submit. I do some rhetorical outlining of pieces in that journal where I write down, okay, what do they do on each page? How many paragraphs do they take to do it? What's the general flow of the argument? And I do that for, like, say, 3 different pieces. So I get a sense, okay, recently in this journal, in stuff related to my topic, here's kind of what the manuscript looked and felt like. And that way I get really close to that, so that when I'm getting mine ready for that the last round of smoothing over, I have a sense for what sorts of things fly with this audience.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm going to make a small plug for TESOL Quarterly. I'm going to ask Laura to take us to slide 10 right now, if she can. And so the first resource, as you can see, authored by Mahbub and colleagues, is entitled TESOL Quarterly Research Guidelines. In that set of guidelines, we also produced a checklist for authors or emerging scholars to refer to, or individuals who want to submit to the journal. So I would say go look at the checklist, right? Because if you feel that you've ticked off many of the items on the checklist or all the items on the checklist, then I would say you're pretty much ready to submit to the journal. But I also agree with Kate, you can form writing groups. But a slight variation of that would be people tend to think that all publications are single authored, but as you all know, many of the publications are also co-authored. So one way to know that you're ready is to actually co-author with other colleagues, classmates, someone who's more experienced, maybe your advisor, and then you would have a greater sense of knowing whether it's ready or not, because there is accountability, and for example, if you're working with two other people, and if they think it's ready to go, then it's probably ready to go, right? But if they don't think it's ready to go, then of course you might want to hold on to the manuscript and fine-tune, tweak the piece until there's consensus among all the authors or co-authors in that respect. Thanks, Laura, for showing the slide, and we could go back to the original slide.
So I definitely was shaking my head a lot as Peter and Kate were both speaking, because I agree a lot with what they've been sharing. Another great reference point too is that a lot of journals, like Peter said, have links to articles like that, but they've taken time to look through kind of the history. So I know that Research in the Teaching of English, or RTE, has offered similar things on their website. I would also say that sometimes you're feeling great when you come off a conference, and so that's a really good time to make sure you have a notebook when you're getting feedback at that conference, or if someone talks to you, like Peter mentioned, about the piece, and maybe just block out a morning or an afternoon to just kind of go back through that piece to extend it if you didn't have a full paper written. And if you did, then it's a great time to use that feedback to maybe revise. And then building on what Kate said about having writing groups and others, folks at MSU know that I've raved a lot about using the Writing Center at Michigan State. I had a Writing Center consultant that I saw for 2 hours every week I was in grad school, at least. And that very much had to do with the fact that I didn't always feel like my advisor or my committee members were people that maybe were as expert in the area, or maybe I just needed someone to help me with the organization of the piece. And if my advisor or others were traveling, or those sorts of things that faculty members have going on, it provided me someone who was literally getting paid to sit next to me and listen to me and think through my work. So I think finding opportunities like that at your own institution, or cultivating a group of others who will give you feedback through a writing group, or even now I have folks that I know I can email and say, hey, can you read these 3 pages and give me feedback in the next couple of days? And cultivating the reciprocity in that sort of way is really helpful. Peter was talking about how pieces can be collaboratively written, but I think more often than not, for me as someone who's really interested in writing, is thinking about how writing is always a collaborative process. And so our pieces get that much better every time someone else can give us feedback or ask a question. And I think in alignment with that second point too, in terms of your advisor or your committee or your writing group, there were a brother-sister duo of scholars who I heard speak once, and they talked about being each other's worst critic. And by doing that, they were therefore each other's best critics, because they were kind of catching the things that others might catch before the piece really went out in the world. And so by having someone who will kind of come down hard on you and give you maybe really critical feedback can really strengthen your piece before it goes out into the world. And so that's not to say that we don't also have perfectionist tendencies, as Kate said, but I do think making sure someone else has read the piece, maybe 2 people at least, before it goes out and giving you that feedback will hopefully help you to have a better chance once it does go out to an editor, to move beyond a desk reject, which happens all the time, or to go out for peer review and get meaningful feedback.
Yeah, I would say the nice thing about being in the academy is that the reviewers in general are out there to help, right? They're not out to get you, okay? They do this out of the goodness of their heart because they're volunteers. So you need to see yourself as part of this larger community. And as Kate mentioned earlier, if you send your article to a top-tier journal, chances are you're going to get really sound feedback, right? That you can use, incorporate, and revise your work. Bear in mind also, sometimes your advisor might not have time. He or she might be too busy, and so in such a situation, submitting a manuscript to a journal would be another way of getting external feedback, right? And one of the things I do as an editor when I'm trying to decide who to assign the manuscript to, I do look at the references list, because if the author is citing someone very frequently in his or her manuscript, then that's the person I would send the manuscript to. And maybe that individual is the scholar whose work you most admire. And that's one way, in that sense, that you're going to get direct feedback from that scholar, if of course that scholar agrees to be a reviewer. And such input is priceless, right? Because here you are citing this person's work, and she's done seminal work in the field, and you're going to be getting direct feedback from her, although anonymously, I mean, in that respect. And so I think there is value in submitting work that's close to ready. Like I said, we all have perfectionist tendencies, but we are also realists in the sense that we have deadlines to meet, and just also to keep in mind that you're not working on just one manuscript at a time, right? You have manuscripts at different levels of preparation. So if you do finish something, you send it off, you're probably going to work on the next manuscript that may be at a 50% level of preparation. And behind that, you might have another manuscript that's at the 20% stage. So, it's like a conveyor belt. So you keep moving. And once you get the feedback, you go back to the original manuscript and you work on it. And so you're constantly getting feedback on not just one manuscript, but multiple manuscripts. And sometimes everything gets published at the same time. And sometimes the first manuscript that you submitted is the last to be published. So just keep that in mind as well.
Can I add just one more thing before we change slides? So building on the idea that reviewers are your friends and there to help you. I also think a great time to submit is right after you've done a review of someone else's work, because it can really help you to think about your piece through the eyes of a reviewer. And so that's something that I found to be really helpful, and especially for doctoral students, there's a lot of journals that do offer opportunities for graduate students to be reviewers. And I think in terms of it is our duty of sorts to give back in the same sorts of ways that we're asking people to share their time with us by providing us feedback.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And before we move into this next slide, I do want to say that I'm talking from an editor's perspective. We are, of course, very much beholden to the reviewers who work, of course, as volunteers for us. And there are cycles when, for example, reviewers are more available. If you submit your manuscript at the start of summer, chances are it's probably going to take a while before you get feedback, because the reviewers are faculty members themselves. And after a very busy academic year, they're going on summer vacation, right? So if you don't hear back from a journal for a manuscript you submitted in May, not till September, don't fret, right? It's because folks are on vacation. It's not that anything's happened to your manuscript. It's just that we need a break ourselves as reviewers. And so just keep that in mind as well. There are periods, lull periods, and then there are periods like, and of course, from the journal editor perspective, we get a whole wave of publications or manuscripts being submitted at the end of summer because authors are working over the summer to get their manuscripts ready for submission.
Great. So the next topic we're going to look at is how we can go about meeting journal requirements and communicating with the editors.
Well, most journals have the guidelines on their website, and so that would be the first place to go. And so they'll tell you, the word limit, if there is one, the styles for references and citations that you should use. Also clearly or carefully check the aims and scope of the journal, because those can change not that infrequently, and that's a main reason for being desk rejected, is if you have a different idea of what the journal is about than the current editors do. And so the aims and scope is really important in that regard. But I would definitely err on the side of extreme carefulness, because I'm not like this as an editor or a reviewer, but I deal with a lot of reviewers that are as an editor. And some people are very persnickety, and they want to make sure that everyone's crossed their T's and dotted their I's. And when I first started attempting to publish, I thought that was not going to be the case, but there are still people out there that if you are right over the word limit or you use a different citation style, people can be less generous in their read of your paper. And so a lot of times I think of writing and publishing as trying to raise the least number of red flags as possible for the editors and the reviewers. And as Peter mentioned earlier, being proactive is usually not frowned upon. Or to put that in not a bunch of double negatives, it's good to check if you're not sure. I wouldn't send an editor a slew of emails, but if you're not sure, sending the abstract along and saying, hey, I've read all of your resources online for the journal. I feel like this is a good fit, but I would love to just get your 2 cents about whether this might fit within the scope of the journal or something like that. If you're on a time crunch and you want to get a sense for what the current time frame is for first decisions, that's also something you can email editors about, and people are usually happy to share that info with you, because some journals it takes a year for first decision, some it takes only a month and a half, and it really depends on where the editors are at that point in time, how many other things they're dealing with. And if time is of the essence, finding that out beforehand can be really helpful. So those are just a couple things.
Kate and Peter, do you mind making sure that we can touch on this last question about what to do if there's no response, even after you've submitted the article? That came up in the chat room.
I will get to that definitely, but I'm going to ask Laura again to jump to slide 10. And going back to what Kate has to say, and really knowing what the journal wants. So I'm directing you to the second resource, the author guidelines link. Every journal has author guidelines, so please consult the guidelines very carefully. Thanks, Laura. If you could go back to that slide. So Cassie, your question was, what if you don't get a response after resubmitting the manuscript? I would say be persistent in that sense. I mean, sometimes editors take a while. Give it a couple of days in that respect. Generally we say it takes about 6 weeks for a manuscript to go out for review. Fact is, it tends to be longer than 6 weeks, because from the time you submit a manuscript, it's not as if we're going to find a reviewer immediately. TESOL Quarterly generally tries to find 3 reviewers per manuscript. If I'm lucky, the first 3 people I approach to review will say yes. But most of the time, I am generally successful with the first person. It may take me a week, 10 days to find a second reviewer to say yes. And it could be another 3 weeks or 4 weeks before I find the third reviewer. So if you add that to that 6-week cycle, we're looking at 10 weeks. And so I urge all of you to be patient in that sense. But if, let's say, 2 months have passed and you're wondering about the status of your manuscript, I think that's enough time for you to send an email to the editor and say, look, what's going on right now, in that sense. And I always respond to email queries like that, and I explain and say, look, it's still out under review. Just be patient. And it's not as if I want to sit on the reviewers' comments after I get them too, right? Because the faster I send out and share the reviewer comments, the sooner you get to work on those comments if you're invited to revise and resign.
Well, and I was going to add to that in terms of what you were saying. You're also able to log back into whatever system you've used to upload your paper, and oftentimes I've found that is still updated in terms of like it's out under review or it's with the editor, and so maybe or have a better idea of when a decision might be coming. And then taking the second point that's here in terms of feedback that might be contradictory, one of the things that I've found is sometimes I do have like one reviewer who really wants this and one reviewer that really wants that. And sometimes the editors do more or less work in synthesizing that for you because they want you to make that decision about which path you really want to be taking for your piece. And other times they'll make recommendations. I've been very fortunate to work with some editors who were very pedagogical in their approach, especially knowing at the time that I was like a doctoral student. So I have to give a shout out to Amanda Tyne and English Teaching Practice and Critique, because they were really great at helping me to synthesize some of the data and even taking the time as the piece, if I had questions that came up, to talk through the piece a bit more over email or otherwise. And so it's a tough decision sometimes to decide which path you want to choose and which path maybe sticks with what the heart of your article is in your own eyes. But that's something that I found that editors are very happy to have conversations about, whether they've done that synthesis for you or they've provided just kind of those rough comments for you to look at. But I don't know if Kate and Peter have other things to add about that.
Going back to the earlier point that Cassie made about using the cover letter to the editor, I think especially when you get to the stage of resubmitting a manuscript, if you have 3 sets or even 4 sets of reviewer feedback, you want to be able to respond to each and every piece of feedback you receive. And so if you don't agree with a certain piece of feedback, then you need to be clear as to why you're disagreeing. Of course, you don't want to end up disagreeing with 80% of what they say, but there might be about 10% that you feel strongly against. And I've used the contradictory feedback to my advantage, where, for example, if reviewer 2 likes it and reviewer 4 doesn't, I will point out to reviewer 4 that, there are strengths, and reviewer 2, for example, kind of spoke to the strengths in my manuscript. Bear in mind that all reviewers get to see each other's comments in that respect. So after a paper has been returned to the author, the online system automatically generates an aggregation of all reviewer comments. So reviewer 1 will get to see what reviewer 4 has to say. Of course, they don't know they don't know the identities of the other reviewers, but they do get to see it. And so I do want to also emphasize that there's value in being a reviewer as well, because not only do you end up giving feedback to an author, you get to see the feedback that the author receives from other peers as well. And so you can benefit as a reviewer, because you are also learning from what the other 3 reviewers might have to say about the manuscript you review.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and move on to the next slide, given the time. And so what I'd like to do is to ask each of you just to share one general writing tip that you would have for beginning researchers and writers. whether that's with regard to publishing or improving their writing.
I'll kick it off again. I think it echoes something I said earlier. I think getting as much feedback from as many different people throughout the different studies that you work on is hugely beneficial. And submitting often and getting right back in there, because again, the feedback you get from editors and reviewers is extremely insightful for developing your own writing craft in ways that'll lead to more successful bids for publication. But I also think just the regularity of writing, trying to write a little bit every day, even if sometimes it's editing work, sometimes it's free writing, sometimes it's writing notes about what you're reading and trying to start drafting that into a paper. It doesn't always have to be starting there with a blank page or working on the scariest parts of whatever it is you're working on. But I do think that when you're in that regular habit of writing every day, or every day that you do work, for those of you that actually take weekends off, which I do, but not everybody's like that. It's really helpful, because then you're kind of on a roll, you're in the habit, and just like exercising or cooking or whatever, if you stop using it, you lose it. So those would be my quick tips.
My advice is just to direct you towards the work of one of my colleagues, Brian Paltridge. Brian was the previous co-editor of TESOL Quarterly, and he's got an amazing book on how to basically revise your dissertation and convert your dissertation into articles and book chapters. So the name's Brian Paltridge. If you Google him, you should find his work, his book, and I would say read that carefully, and it'll give you very good advice on how to move forward in the next phase of your writing career.
I'm also going to recommend all of the things that Kate and Peter said, but I think on top of that, it's also really important, especially if you're writing the dissertation, to find some time to read something beautiful. I think we often count writing or reading for the pieces that we're working on out of academic journals as something that we need to do and count that as writing time. But I think reading something that's like really beautiful helps you to remember how to tell a story well, and can help to make your work a little more creative maybe. And so I think finding something that you can either listen to on Audible, or if it's poetry, or even just reading to children if you have them, finding something else that is going to help to push you forward in your own writing.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing your tips there. We do have a couple questions that have popped up in the chat window or in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask Amanda to throw those out at us.
Okay, the first one is directed to Peter. Peter, does TESOL Quarterly use double-blind review?
Yes.
Okay. And it looks like each of our questions have been answered. Rafana, if you have another question, please let us know. But I believe we answered your questions. Any other questions, you can type it in the chat screen, and we would be happy to help support you. I just quickly want to ask one more time. I think rejection is such a big thing in this part of our academic career. So are there any bits of advice that you can give us about handling that and pushing forward? I know, Kate, you mentioned developing a thick skin and writing every day. Can we see more about this? Because I feel like as doc students and emerging scholars, this is a vulnerable place.
I'm happy to... go ahead, Kate. You can go ahead.
So, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say onward and upward became sort of a little mantra throughout grad school for me, where if you get an award, that's great, and you can celebrate that day and pop a bottle of champagne, but like the next morning you have to get up and go to work again, because you have to keep moving forward. And the same is true for a day that you get a rejection. If you need to go for a long run, or just like order pizza and like binge Netflix with friends or family, and kind of wallow in that, that's okay. But you have to like get up and keep going tomorrow. So onward and upward, like, was a great motivator for me, whether it was something really positive that happened or if it was the rejection from anything. And with the idea of rejection, I once read something about like aiming for 100 rejections a year, because somewhere along the line you'll start to get things. So that was really helpful last year on the job market, because I got way more rejections than I had ever gotten before, which was a good goal. But I think thinking about all of the times you're putting something out is like it's a really important thing. And it will help you to continue to kind of reframe your work. But Kate, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think part of it too is figuring out what you need and what works for you in terms of being able to get over the emotional impact it initially has. And rejections do hurt. And I found that they don't hurt quite as bad as they used to, but they still always hurt. And my reaction is always to kind of let it sit for that day, talk about it to whoever. I'm lucky enough that my husband's an academic too, so he gets it and we can just kind of kvetch about it. But then the next day I'm like, I'm going to show them. So I get angry and strong about it. I've seen other people that hide for a while and they don't want to look at the reviews. They don't want to think about it because it's scary. And sometimes people just need more time, but sometimes it can be a kind of avoidance strategy. And so I think you need to all figure out for yourselves what's the appropriate length of time to chill, and then what's the time to get back into it. And just like people say, when you fall off a horse, you get right back on. That's been the strategy that works for me. And I would also say that very carefully attend to the feedback that you did get if you were lucky enough to get any feedback. It might not be the same kind of feedback that you would get for the next outlet you shoot for, but the more you understand the different ways that a wide range of people are hearing what you have to say can help you kind of ward off misunderstandings that those reviews might represent. And so I wouldn't say, oh, well, they just don't get it. I would say, well, why don't they get it? How can I help rewrite this section so that more people don't misunderstand that section in the way that that person did?
Yeah.
Over and out.
I think you need to be persistent, and it may take 3 or 4 journals that you submit to before it's eventually accepted. And or you might decide after 2 journals, you say, you know, I'm kind of done here. I've got other papers I want to work on, but I'm quite happy to recast this manuscript and send it off as a book chapter. So in that respect, then, you know, all my effort hasn't been wasted. The other thing is, and going back to the idea of contradictory reviewer comments, sometimes some reviewer comments might be opaque to you and you might not be able to understand or break down what the reviewers are saying. This is when I think you should approach your advisor or senior colleague, or if you're a PhD student, a more advanced PhD student, to sit down with that individual and help you unpack the reviewer comments, because that person might have a better understanding of what the reviewer is asking of you. So it's a combination of trying to figure out what is being asked of you and then delivering that request on revision.
It looks like we have one more question. First, thank you all for that very helpful advice. I think that that's a conversation that needs to continue. And I think when people hear others' ideas, they sort of learn how to better deal with the rejections themselves. So thank you for all of your insights. The last question that I'm looking at, we had a attendee ask, there has been no response for a journal, and it's been quite some time. I know we addressed that a little bit earlier, but can anyone give further advice?
It happened to me.
I can, sorry, Cassie, were you talking to?
Go ahead.
Okay. If you haven't already emailed the editors or editor, I would do that and just be very polite and just say, hey, I was just wondering, you know, I submitted this X months ago, and I was just wondering if you have a sense for what the timeline is that you're working under right now. That way it positions it as it's not them deciding to ignore you, but you recognize there's constraints and whatnot. Sometimes it's the case that they have a really big backlog, and in that case, you can decide to pull it and send it somewhere else. And I did that once with a journal that hadn't responded over 9 months, and I was in a pickle. And so I decided to pull it once they wrote back and said, yeah, we're behind by 6 months. But I wouldn't, I would definitely always email the editor. Just do so in a way that comes across as kind of humble and polite, and you're likely to get at least information, if not information that you want to hear.
Thank you. I know that we're about out of time, but I see one more question. This question is, if we write the same data and framework in the dissertation for publication, isn't it a self-plagiarism? And to what degree is it different from dissertation writing?
Well, your dissertation is an unpublished manuscript, so it's not self-plagiarism because, I mean, we write the dissertation on the understanding that you're going to get it published somewhere. No, I mean, we all start from our dissertation.
Okay, thank you. I believe that all of the questions were addressed, Christina. So if we want to close up.
Yeah. So as you can see, or as we mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the notes and recording from today's presentation with you all following our session. We do have 2 other webinars that you can be on the lookout for, one in January about entering the job market, and one in March about how to navigate AERA and find your scholarly home. I'm going to ask Peter and Kate just to share a little bit about seeking out joining the SIGs if you're interested. And you can also stay connected with us on social media.
Yes, for those of you who are not members of either the LSP or SLR SIG, please consider joining us. As you can see, we've got a number of activities lined up, including the upcoming webinars, and we're moving into conference season, so please also look out for those other opportunities in the new calendar year.
I'll add to that for the LSP SIG, and I'm sure there are similar things with the other SIG too, we have the mentoring session that Cassie mentioned earlier that she's been involved in, and so we'll send out a call for folks who are early career to pair up with someone. They'll get assigned to pair up with someone who's more mid or advanced career to get feedback on a piece of writing, and that's a really exciting part of our program. And we also have a grad student mixer that our lovely reps organize every year, and that's a great way to meet folks because you guys are each other's peers moving forward, and so the connections that you make in casual and fun ways now can become really important professional connections that you'll have as you advance through your career.
Kate, real quick, do you know about when that call goes out for the mentorship? Or Cassie, I believe you might have information or may remember. Do you know when the call goes out for that?
We usually put the call out after the schedule has come out. So it's late February, early March.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Kate and Cassie and Peter for sharing all of your pearls of wisdom with us today about the writing life of being a scholar. And I want to thank all of you also for joining us today and for the enriching conversation. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have follow-up questions, including how to get involved in the SIG, either as a member or getting involved in general. And like I said, we'll be sending these resources along to you soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.